Hello and welcome to Lamestream, a show that guides you through the crisis in media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. Scott, what's up? How are you?
I'm pretty well. I'm pretty well. How do we find you this week, Oz?
Oh, I'm feeling fine. There's some sad news out of Hollywood. I feel like, it's not so uncommon these days that we mention on the show the passing of another Hollywood giant. A couple that we wanted to touch on at the top of things. The first, the great Robert Duvall, who died this week,
Oof.
aged 95. I mean, where do you begin with Rob? Like Godfather, probably one of the most iconic films, one of the most iconic roles. Tom Hagen, the Kraut Mick consigliere of the Don. Apocalypse Now. You and I, Scott, we share a lot of things, including a taste for films from the 70s. How you feeling about Duvall's passing?
Is the statute of limitations kind of passed with calling people kraut mix? Are we okay with that?
I'm quoting the film, and I guess from my perspective, when it comes to 1950s like German Irish slurs, I think I get a free pass. But if
We
I've
should
offended
come up with
any,
someone we can refer to that on the regular. I don't know if Matthias Cormann is getting back in the news, but my kraut mick friend Matthias Cormann could be good.
is he
No,
is
but
he is he not?
he's
Yeah.
definitely not Irish. Um, I mean, Robert Duvall, yeah, some heaters in there. I loved his later in life turn in the Jack Reacher film, which was
Mm.
clearly Tom Cruise just going, I think Bob Duvall still has some heaters. Get him in here for a swan song.
Yeah, he was great right until the end. Like he was awesome in the Steve McQueen film Widows, playing this kind of like
Mm.
corrupt Irish Chicago kind of democratic politician too. But yeah, if you as someone who for whatever reason has never checked out the filmography of Robert Duvall, it's hard to find a bad film. The other person, Scott, I wanted to mention briefly, and I don't know if we've ever talked about him or his films before. Frederick Wiseman, who passed away this week, aged 96. One of the greatest, if not the greatest, documentary filmmakers to ever have lived and worked. His documentaries, particularly when he started, they focused a lot on kind of working people in their jobs, places like meatpacking plants. He focused on institutions, everything from places that we put people who are mentally unwell to hospitals to the criminal justice system. He focused a lot on cities and places and how different people from different cultures, backgrounds, classes kind of came together. His films were really noticeable for their lack of interviews, no narration, no score. These things that seemingly feel like random vignettes of people's lives, but absolutely have structure and purpose and a point to make. He's an amazing filmmaker. Are you much of a Wiseman head?
No, but I need to delve in. I need to delve in big time. But I'm familiar with a lot of those, but have not spent the time to dive in. But Oz, can I just leave you with,
Hang on,
you
hang on,
know, I
hang on. I
know.
want to recommend two Wiseman things before you do that. Okay,
Okay,
so
all right, go for it.
well, yeah, for you, Scott, or anyone else who's not checked them out, my two faves, In Jackson Heights, amazing film about the suburb in New York. And his most recent film, his last film before he died, Menu Plaisir. It's a 4 hour documentary on a three Michelin starred French restaurant. If you care about food, hospitality, dining, people, farming, I know things that you care a lot about, Scott. You got to
Yeah,
give this film a go.
great recommendations. I'm definitely going to check out Menu Plaisir. Um, to give us something other than people passing away to kick off the show,
Sure,
a bit
sure.
of up, an upbeat story about two lame stream heads. This is a little self-indulgent, Oz, but my dear, wonderful, beautiful cousin, Antoinette Tony Mitchell,
Hmm.
last night, before we're recording this, found herself in a parking lot with Usman Khawaja. Spied Usman,
Awesome.
went over, asked him for a photo. He was gracious enough to provide, and they had a little chat. Tony was very starstruck. She loved it. She's a huge Usman Khawaja fan. And,
As
you
you should
know,
be.
I know Tony will be listening, but if Usman, if you're listening, thanks for letting my cousin grab a pic. Um, I
That's
hope,
sweet.
I mean, I'm unconfirmed, but I hope that is two lame stream heads, having a great moment in the real world.
I mean, we know Usman's a great lamestream head. Are you worried about your cousin being engaged with what you do?
No, I just thought I'd leave some ambiguity about whether Usman was a lamestream head so we weren't outing him. But sure, if we're happy to, then yeah, go for it.
I don't think we get in trouble for that. He's shared our stuff, It's not a secret that
That's true.
that he's got his finger on the pulse of media. Speaking of the media, Scott, let's get into today's episode. What we're going to be covering: Australia's media, Scott, has gone from ignoring the threat of Pauline Hanson and One Nation to doing pretty much a 180 and talking about them basically non-stop. We're going to look at exactly how different outlets are covering the rise of the far-right party and whether they've learnt any lessons from the rest of the world, plus what we'd ideally like to see more and less of. The focus on the last couple of weeks being squarely on the conservative side of politics. What's Labor been up to? How's Anthony Albanese dealing with this kind of turmoil on the right? We'll be diving into that topic as well and looking at whether the relentless coverage of the Liberal Party has meant a bit less scrutiny on the people actually in power, the Labor government. And in keeping tabs, what is the Sydney Morning Herald's position on the New South Wales government's controversial protest laws? In fact, who is even editing the Sydney Morning Herald? The international podcast tour that Australia and Australia's media just can't get enough of, and the Stephen Colbert censorship scandal that shows just how much control Trump now has over the American media.
And as always, Oz, before we get into that, a huge thank you to all of our subscribers. Independent media doing this podcast is only possible thanks to all of the people that have subscribed. And if you're just discovering the show, if you're just getting on board, then we'd encourage you to become subscribers. You get access to all of our exclusive journalism. We're putting out investigations, analysis pieces, newsletters via the website lamestream.com.au, along with a whole host of other benefits like access to an ad-free version of the show and all kinds of other stuff. So if you want to support what we're doing and help us make this podcast a reality, lamestream.com.au.
Get around it, folks. Scott, before we get into the coverage of Pauline Hanson and One Nation specifically, why don't we pick up where we left things off on Monday's episode and look at a little bit of what the Liberal Party has been up to. On Monday, quite a few journalists, I would go as far as to say basically every political journalist in Canberra, reported on this immigration plan that the former leader, Susan Lee, had been cooking up before she was rolled by Angus Taylor.
Yes.
I thought this was a curious leak, the reporting of this plan, both in terms of the timing and the motivation. But before we get into that, let's just run through what was actually in it. Basically, this plan was for there to be a ban on migration from people in so-called terror hotspots in 13 countries, including places like Gaza, Somalia, Afghanistan, and the Philippines, and also to screen people at the border for their comments on social media that might be construed as being unaligned with, quote, Australian values. This is something directly lifted from Donald Trump. This policy is highly deranged and kind of obviously an attempt to introduce some sort of Muslim ban without explicitly saying that, right?
Yeah, it absolutely is that. When you just start declaring countries of origin as unacceptable, all of which happen to be Muslim. Like I've been so frustrated about this, I can sort of barely contain myself. To remind people, when Trump announced this, he also just banned certain countries. He didn't actually call it a Muslim ban. It fell on the American media to declare it a Muslim ban and declare that it was racist. The New York Times, when he did that back in 2017, the editorial board of the Times wrote an op-ed declaring that Donald Trump's Muslim ban is cowardly and dangerous. They editorially, he said it was just a ban on these countries. They said editorially, we believe this is what it is. It is a ban on Muslim immigration.
In normal terms.
Yeah. And but here, the media are treating this like it's a genuine policy idea that has some merits to it. Like, if anyone's read any of the coverage, it's like, well, the coalition say that this is about security concerns. Some experts disagree. What's the right balance? That is just insane to me that years on from that Trump Muslim ban, the Australian media cannot have the sort of spine to meet this moment. And I just want to be very clear that this whole guise of security is absolute bullshit. It is not how radicalization happens. It is not how these threats occur. There are already intelligence and background checks. And then, like, first generation migrants, the people that come here are not anywhere near the groups and the demographics of people that even do get radicalized, those who do. The entire thing is a cover for racial and racial and cultural components to our immigration policy.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like there is this broad incoherence kind of across all parties on immigration policy, right? Because they all want to look like they're being really tough by focusing on these countries where we really don't have an enormous amount of immigration from. Like, we don't really let that many Garsons into this country. So that they want the focus there, while in reality, every single party also knows that they need immigration because of the skill shortages in this country, the fact that like the economy relies on bringing in people with skills to kind of do basic functions and even kind of like more highly skilled functions as well. I mean, maybe it's worth doing a kind of bigger conversation about immigration policy and kind of the incoherence in the debate down the track. We've gotten a bunch of different emails about it, a lot of listeners who want some kind of sane conversation about it. So we might put a pin in the immigration stuff, but I do think it might be worth discussing later. In terms of the Liberal policy leak and the timing of it, this is kind of interesting. My guess on it is Susan Lee or perhaps people close to her who worked on this policy dropped this to the media. I think they were hoping to have some kind of impact like, you know, look, Susan Lee was going to be hardline in immigration. She's not this kind of soft centrist that Angus Taylor and the right of the party are painting her as. And perhaps she also knew that Taylor wanted to go into this kind of direction to mark a end with the Lee era. And so she's sort of trying to box him in. She's saying, you know, well, if you, Angus Taylor, announce a policy like this, I can say, actually, this was my policy all along, and you guys are all idiots for rolling me and going with this guy. Ultimately, I don't really think that matters, to be honest, because Susan Lee's gone. She's now a footnote in Australian political history. I think Taylor's going to go hard on immigration because he thinks he has to grow his vote. And I don't think when that happens, people will be like, oh, you've borrowed this from Lee. But Scott, I'm curious as to whether you think there's anything interesting or notable about the timing of this particular.
I think the thing I'm more taking away from it is that looking forward to what is going to happen, as you say, I think Taylor will go hard on immigration, and that's largely because he has no real plan for how to save the Liberal Party, and we know this because apparently he did not make much of a strategy pitch to people last week when he was canvassing support. He didn't really lay out a big shift and plan. He needs a point of difference. This is going to be it, I think, without actually resolving a lot of the big conflicts that are in the Liberal Party. But as we said on Monday, I don't think it's going to necessarily help the Liberals a lot. One Nation can outflank them on this. But I think the very scary thing about the coalition adopting a policy like this, if they do officially, is it shifts the window of debate to the right. You're already seeing how the media is treating a Muslim ban as a credible policy that is part of the new center, and it just opens the door to even more racialized policies to come if that becomes the new center of debate.
Yeah, I know I said that we didn't want to get into the immigration stuff too deeply, but just to kind of underscore your point about how this is a Muslim ban by stealth. The Philippines, a lot of people are thinking, well, that's like famously a Catholic country. What's that got to do with it? I mean, Philippines does have a sizable Muslim minority, and conveniently for Susan Lee and the Liberals, the region of the Philippines that they banned migration from or want to ban migration from happens to be the Muslim region of the Philippines.
Yes.
So it's this insane example where they're like, we know Australia needs, Filipino labor to help staff hospitals and retirement homes and all that sort of stuff, but we just don't want them from these islands that are Muslim. And like you said, the opportunity was there to spell that out explicitly, and it just was not taken by the media. You mentioned, Scott, there, like One Nation being able to outflank the Liberals on this. They're already taking credit for the Liberal Party's shift to this more extreme immigration policy. We've mentioned One Nation a lot over the last couple of weeks, but in this episode, we specifically wanted to look at how they're being covered and reported on a little bit more closely.
Mm.
And just to kind of recap our kind of thesis as to why One Nation is worth discussing in a fair amount of detail, we said last year after the election that despite Labor's big landslide win, Australian politics is still very vulnerable to the rise of extremist right-wing politics, and One Nation was likely to be the best vehicle for that. And that was back when they were polling 6 to 7% of the vote. Some people said we were overacting or we were crazy. The rest of the media largely just ignored the party and they were treated as a sort of sideshow or a curiosity. And that continued
Yeah.
even as they ended up securing the backing of Gina Rinehart, Australia's richest person, and even as they recruited the former Deputy Prime Minister, one of the most well-known political figures in the country, Barnaby Joyce. Now the party has comfortably overtaken the coalition as the biggest force on the right of politics. Now the party has comfortably overtaken the coalition as the biggest force on the right side of politics, and the media coverage has switched gears. They are reporting on them, but overwhelmingly, Scott, that coverage consists of just signal boosting the most incendiary things that they say without any context, without any explanation of how racist they are. I think that is an approach that effectively equates to free advertising for the party, and I just don't think you can call it journalism. Before we get into specifics and examples of that, Scott, you've been looking at how One Nation used to be covered in its first iterations and how much more robust and critical that kind of reporting was. Can you break that down a little bit?
Yeah, this has been really interesting for me. So people will probably know that Pauline Hanson got elected in 1996 as this random backbencher for a seat in Ipswich, and she gave her first speech to Parliament, and that was the launching pad for her whole career. And in it, she said she was afraid of Australia being swamped by Asians, all of this racist rhetoric that had not been heard in Australian politics for a long, long time. And the chamber emptied. Like, members from both sides left because they didn't want to give this stuff attention, but the media picked out this speech from a first-time backbencher, particularly the tabloid newspapers and daytime talk shows, and they blew her up into a massive star. I found a study, Oz, from that year that showed after she gave that speech, in the months after that, the media published as many articles about her as John Howard, the guy that had just been elected Prime Minister. You know, so
you can't hate these people enough sometimes.
I know. So they played a huge role in overinflating her and giving her this national stardom, and the shock value sound bites that filled papers and TV minutes, you know, got One Nation up into the mid-teens in popularity by the end of the 1990s. And it looked like she'd make a huge dent at the federal election in 98. But then, Oz, serious media, the old Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, 60 Minutes, Four Corners, really put her under the microscope. And you go back and it's fascinating. She's fact-checked with real migration figures. She doesn't know what she is talking about. Interviewers said to her point blank, "You're not talking in a pub anymore. You're a federal politician. You have to know what you're talking about." Directly confronted her. And she was exposed massively. Maybe one of the best examples that I came across looking into all of this was a Four Corners from 1998, which raised questions about whether people involved in One Nation were National Socialists, which of course is Nazis. And the tensions that story exposed basically led to a split in One Nation that destroyed the party for a decade. But to just show you how different the coverage was when the media turned a critical eye on Hanson, here is the reporter from that Four Corners, one Tony Jones, describing how dangerous the politics of race is when you combine it with right-wing nationalism.
Small prejudices to be confused with grand passion.
Australians somewhere are freedom, for we are young and free. With open smile and welcome love.
So that the politics of race has become mixed up with nationalism, the most dangerous combination known.
So it was reporting like that, Oz, that very explicitly says how dangerous this is, that popped the bubble of One Nation's popularity the first time round. And when I highlight that, it's not about saying I want the media to attack them because I am progressive and they are right wing, even though that may be a good enough reason. But it's just like, that's how you question politicians who want huge power over the lives of Australians, and you describe their ideology correctly and with accuracy and detail. Like, it's just not that big an ask.
Yeah, as we step through some of these examples, I think it'll be pretty obvious how much things have fallen. And this is such a recurring theme of our show, right? Is like, there are these hypersensitive journalists, even people who like, you know, are our friends and close to us and listen to the show and respect what we do, who think that we're demanding something kind of radical and insane and we want every journalist to become like a left-wing communist activist. But it is so telling to literally just go back and look at what their idols, like Tony Jones on Four Corners on the ABC, used to be able to do. Like, if you don't want to do what we do what Tony Jones used to do back in the day.
Yeah,
it's not a
exactly.
crazy suggestion. Over the last couple of days, I feel like we can start with something in the present that is happening to look at exactly how the media is not doing what you were just outlining. Hanson has generated an enormous amount of coverage this week over comments she made about Muslims, right? Particularly this line that there are no good Muslims. She said this on Monday night on Sherry Markson's show on Sky News. And we'll get into how that was reported by different media outlets. But I just want to pause for a second, right? This generated headlines everywhere. It got her follow-up radio and TV interviews. It was covered not just by your news.coms and your Daily Mails. It was covered by The Guardian, The Australian, the SMH, The Age, the ABC, everywhere. The fact that this generated so much coverage is, in and of itself, I think, pretty revealing in terms of the moment we're in. This is Hanson going on a nighttime Sky News program just to restate her party thesis. I don't like Muslims and I don't want them in Australia. There is not a single other party in this country, not Labor, not the Coalition, not the Greens, that would get blanket coverage like this simply for stating their fundamental party thesis. Like, can you imagine if Larissa Waters went on a lefty podcast and said, I think climate change is pretty bad and I think we should do something about it, and then was all over the news for the next 2 or 3 days? It just would never happen. And this, I think, speaks to this structural bias towards covering one nation in this way that exists in the media right now. And I guess to underscore that, it's worth looking at some of the specific ways they do it across different outlets. On Wednesday morning, Hanson was invited on to ABC News Breakfast to discuss her views. Let's listen to the opening question of this interview.
Has further cemented the growing support for One Nation in recent opinion surveys. For the first time in its 29-year history, One Nation is polling above 20% nationally and seems to be around the combined vote of the Liberal and National parties. We had the Prime Minister in the studio yesterday talking about this and more, and now we're joined by the leader of One Nation, Pauline Hanson. Now, Pauline, welcome to News Breakfast.
Thank you very much.
Now, what do you put down your rising support to?
I think people are looking at our policies, what we want to do for the country and for people. The big issues have been mass migration, the net zero, and also the cost of living. They're the three of the main things that are concerning Australians.
Scott, I can't believe these interviews. Like, she's literally just asked, why are you so popular, right, as an opening question, and gets to shoot off racist talking point after racist talking point about mass migration, right, which, as we've discussed on the show, is a far-right white supremacist term that even liberals, even some liberals think goes too far. She's allowed to say that on the ABC, on breakfast television, with no interjection and no follow-up. Later in that interview, she doubled down on her comments on Muslims, saying it isn't just a minority of extremists when this was put to her by the host, James Gunday, who did try a couple of times to interject at this stage. She said all Muslims want a global caliphate, right? Like, Hanson, this is what bothers me about these kinds of interviews, Scott, is you occasionally see someone try to be like, oh, I should probably push back because she's saying there are entire suburbs like Lakemba that are no-go zones. I should maybe mention that I've been to Lakemba once to disprove it. But, like, Hanson is so inarticulate as a communicator and so incoherent with her arguments. She's actually probably one of the easiest politicians to debate with. And I know I've done this. I've debated Pauline Hanson on live television when I was 24, when I was a uni dropout, when I didn't have any experience in journalism, and I was able to hold her to account. It's not that fucking hard. Yet seasoned, experienced news journalists who studied the craft of journalism and are presenting the most prominent TV shows in the country still seemingly can't do it. Like, help me understand why this is so bad.
I don't know if I can help you understand. I will say, I mean, even more egregious, we played it a couple of weeks ago, but, we've heard in the last couple of weeks it come out of journalists' own mouths, not Hanson's. 7:30 had a piece where a reporter just went, well, here in Tamworth, One Nation's really popular. People see immigration as linked to house prices and intergenerational wealth. They're pretty popular. Like, sorry, what? Just state, can you imagine going to Albanese's lecturate in Grangler and being like, well, here on the ground, Albanese's very popular. They think he's doing well. Or like going to Will's and being like, Samantha Ratnam, a lot of supporters here say that Gaza is a genocide. I can't imagine the ABC doing that. But like, it is remarkable how poor, the fact-checking live within interviews, I think this is somehow seen today like it's some wild new technique that journalists have to be very trained in, like to deal with post-truth Trumpian politics. And when you go back and look at these old interviews, as I have, it's the bare minimum. This is not an old thing to fact-check with, to fact-check guests. I saw so many great examples of, just bringing out contradictions in her policies, which still exist today. Like when she claims she's on the side of working class Australians and all of this, but she is also opposed to, support payments for single mothers. In the 90s, interviewers knew how to draw out that contradiction and make her look very not genuine, hypocritical, not actually representative of the demographic she claims to represent and is trying to reach and convince with her message. Yeah. That was in like a time when the media was more insular, if anything, more white, more, inner city. And those journalists seemed more equipped to deal with Hanson than we are today.
Yeah, it is remarkable how simple a lot of this stuff is and how hard it seems to be for journalists to do it. And it's like what you're outlining. It's so simple. It's this difference between just saying, come on our show and say whatever you want, or we will just give you a platform to spread what you've said in our live blogs or on social media. It's that versus you've got a contention, right? Put it to us and we will politely but firmly question you and expose the obvious hypocrisies inherent there. And like, so little of that is happening right now. And like, to look at the reaction to Hanson's comments about there being no good Muslim, like there's something, here are some examples, right? So on Instagram, 10 News put up a post of Hanson with her quote, "How can you tell me there are good Muslims?" ? Photo of her. And the caption said, "Hanson delivers an extraordinary rant," right? Like on social media, that is literally just like what a One Nation post would look like. Yet it is being done by an alleged independent news organization. In the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age's coverage of these comments, they said Hanson unleashed during a Sky News appearance, right? That use of that term unleashed seems to be a fave of sub-editors in terms of whenever they want to do a story about Hanson's incendiary comments. In The Guardian, they were reporting Barnaby Joyce's reaction to Hanson's comments, and Joyce was doing this thing where he's like, I don't know if I'd go that far, but also like Muslims are pretty scary and we probably shouldn't have them in the country. He was quoted as saying, "What do you see in England? What do you see in France? Just wait. You'll see it in Sydney. You'll see it in Melbourne." Scott, to me, in some ways, this was the worst. In fact, not in some ways. This was the worst thing I'd read this week because they didn't even bother explaining what that quote was. Like, that is Joyce repeating the worst, the most racist, the most white supremacist, far-right propaganda that exists in the global far-right movement right now.
Yes.
This idea that countries in Europe have, quote, fallen to Muslim migration, and Australia is next. And they just ran that straight forward without any explanation of that. And if you're still struggling to understand, like, why we're pretty, like, annoyed at this kind of coverage, here's a thought experiment for you, right? Imagine Pauline Hanson said, "There are no good Jews." Could you imagine media companies promoting that quote, saying, that's an extraordinary comment to make? Could you imagine the SMH writing straight, "Hanson unleashes on Jews"? Could you imagine The Guardian quoting Joyce describing a Jewish takeover of Sydney and Melbourne. Like, there is no way that any of those outlets would ever in a million years report those comments like that. And if Hanson did speak about any other minority, to be honest with you, in this way, they would dedicate themselves to explicitly condemning it, to doing explainers, to doing breakdowns, to explaining how racist it was, to piling pressure on Hanson and other politicians to disavow her. But because her target is Muslims, she can say whatever she wants, and she can also get the entire media ecosystem, to broadcast them for her as well. And I think like that is not only a function of just how long and ingrained the racism directed to Muslims from media outlets is in Australia, going all the way back to 9/11. I think it's also, like you pointed out, how white and insular the media was in the 90s. And there was a brief period where it started to get a little bit better. At the ABC, I still think there are like serious attempts to make the media reflect the country more broadly. But the rest of the newsrooms, if anything, have gone backwards, right? There are so few Muslims working in the media that I think part of the reason why we see this is that there is zero social consequence for news outlets who take this kind of approach. You know, like to kind of just focus on The Guardian because that particular post enraged me so much. I think there are something like 130 journalists working there. I believe 1 to 2 of them are Muslim. At the SMH, which has hundreds of journalists, I believe there is 1 Muslim reporter. Scott, you and I at Lamestream Media have as many Muslim reporters as them, and there are literally 2 of us. Right? Like, the media in Australia is literally an elite white enclave that is becoming, and particularly since October 7 and the treatment of Arab and Muslim journalists, becoming more insular and more white as the country is going in the opposite direction. Quite seriously, and I think maybe to you and I, we understand this, to journalists, they get it, but to people out there who don't see newsrooms or haven't been in newsrooms, if you want an example of the world that someone like Thomas Sewell wants to live in, look at your average Australian newsroom. Like, it is a white nationalist wet dream. And I kind of am not emphasizing this to say if there's some token representation, if they hire a couple more junior Muslim reporters, will fix all of these problems. I'm not naive enough to think that's how this stuff works, but I'm more trying to explain why outlets can get away with treating Muslims like this, because they just don't have enough people in their newsrooms or in their lives to point out to them, this is pretty bad. What are you guys doing? They have no proximity to the targets of Hanson, so they don't experience a kind of backlash to their approach.
I didn't expect you to expose our hiring policies. I feel like we should explain that the only reason that we hired me was to try and give, Gen Z white men a alternative to Joe Rogan. Was the only reason that we hired me.
Well, I think that you're appealing to Gen Z white men. That's amazing. Yeah, we're the only media company with a white quota, just to make sure we can reach mainstream Australia.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think that the not to keep harping on going back and doing this research on how One Nation used to be covered, but I just think the interesting thing about the fact that that was being done when the media was even whiter is it just made me appreciate, I think other factors that intersect with that is, I think, as we've discussed a lot, the management of most media companies is more right-wing. They promote journalists who are more right-wing, or at least are less combative, less assertive, less opinionated. And that's not to say every journalist today is worse. That's clearly not true. But I think if you look at the prestigious positions like the big television anchors, the chief political correspondents, if you are not, if you are less assertive, if you are less combative, you are more likely to get into those positions today. And I think, today the people that fill those positions are just generally less intellectually curious and engaged with history and society and political ideology, and so much worse equipped to handle a situation as delicate and important and where the stakes are so high as this. And there is some of those people who make it through the net, but if you care about understanding those things, I just think you're going to find it harder to get into the top spots than you would have 20 years ago, and the people in them aren't engaged. They're likely to be a compliant drone if they get that far in the business today.
Yeah, totally right. It's to do with like the makeup in terms of like both political ideology and class and all these things about who gets to say these things, right? Like someone like Barry Cassidy coming from a left-wing political background, working for Labor governments, getting a
Yeah.
premier, slot on something like Insiders. That person is now, and like literally in the form of David Spears, an ex-Sky News presenter, and the next version of that will be someone even more compliant, right? Who went to an elite university from an elite suburb in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, who just doesn't rock the boat. And yeah, I think that's actually a really smart way of breaking down the shift. I think it is more to do with that than it is to do with like diversity within newsrooms. All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple more examples of the media totally missing the moment on One Nation and what Labor and Anthony Albanese have to say about all of this. Scott, the other key example I wanted to discuss in terms of the coverage of One Nation was the ABC's Four Corners episode on Monday night. I'll be straight up. This was a very, very strange hour of television. It was hosted by Patricia Karvelis, and all of her Four Corners are very weird. Like, there's very little, if any, investigative journalism in them. They are largely just interviews with politicians and other talking heads. It kind of feels like something that could run as like a 20-minute segment on News 24, and that would be fine. But it is weirder when it takes up a whole slot on Australia's flagship investigation.
Yeah, you made me watch this for this conversation, and I feel like the best Four Corners sort of fall into two categories. They're either an investigation with huge breaks and exclusives, or they are kind of a documentary film, right? And this is sort of neither. It sort of struck me as very similar to like a video essay. Like it is sort of a video of a long form Patricia Karvelis article. It is sort of a video essay of the journalist that I could imagine reading, but happened to be set to images.
Yeah. It's such a funny way of putting it. I totally agree. Look, the kind of framing of the show, it was pitched as this kind of episode about tensions within the Liberals, hooked to the fact that this leadership change just happened. But it did focus a lot on One Nation as well. I mean, that's fine. Like, it's hard to talk about what's going on with the Liberals without talking about One Nation. But in regards to its focus on One Nation and how it did cover them, it was pretty woeful. Barnaby Joyce, this kind of pattern would occur where Barnaby Joyce would just say completely insane things to Patricia Karvelis. And just when you're like, cool, this is Four Corners, you're a very serious, high-profile journalist, you should ask him a question to follow up what he just said. That is completely crazy. It would just cut away. It was like left hanging, and we'd go to some footage of some Liberal MP I've never heard of walking a corridor. like a couple of examples of this, Joyce compared himself and One Nation explicitly to the far-right white nationalist extremists in Germany and France, right? Which I think sets up a series of obvious questions about One Nation's politics and approach. Like, oh, do you see yourself in the vein as Marine Le Pen, who leads the National Front, whose father was a fascist, who were trying their best to bring back fascist politics? It raises so many questions about One Nation claiming that they are not racist, they're just there for working people, while he's comparing himself to real-life white nationalists around Europe. There is literally no follow-up question or interrogation of that comparison whatsoever. He then says he's opposed to Pauline Hanson wearing the burqa, not because of like some ideological or principled or moral or ethical reason, because it clashes with his attempt, right? Remember, he's now running for the Senate in New South Wales, clashes with his attempt to appeal to voters in Western Sydney, which again raises a whole bunch of questions about the party's approach to Western Sydney, to Muslims. Like, what are they trying to do? Does Karvelis follow up with a single question about that? No, not a single question. Just another cut to something else, right? And then this bit about Gina Reinhardt. Gina Reinhardt has already identified herself as a massive supporter of One Nation, right? The Guardian's done great reporting showing that she gives Hanson and Joyce access to a plane. We don't know exactly yet the financial contribution she's making to the party, but we will find that out soon because of the way disclosures work like that. She has also been reported as helping convince hedge fund managers who used to donate to the Liberals to switch their support to One Nation. Is Joyce asked about any of that? The only question Karvelis asked Joyce about Reinhardt wasn't about donations. It was about whether or not they had conversations about Joyce joining One Nation. Like, it just leaves so much hanging there. Like, this is Four Corners, the nation's premier investigative show, interviewing the former deputy prime minister who's now helping lead the nation's second most popular political party, and they're just giving him free kick after free kick. This, to me, was like the exact opposite of what journalism should be.
The example of that sort of cutting out of things before interrogating them that drove me up the wall was at one point Carvelis gets a liberal to kind of bite on, this nebulous idea of sort of the makeup of immigration, and sort of gets him to bite on that he's talking about Muslims and Islamic immigration. And he just goes, well, I do think we need to get the balance right of who comes into the country. And then it just cuts out of that and leaves it. And at no point is there so if I'm an audience member, I'm like, well, is the balance right? Maybe there are too many Muslims coming in. There's no just simple fact check, either delivered directly to him in the interview or in VO later. Muslim immigration is 1/10 of all immigration. There are more English people who come here than Muslims. There's to not clarify that, I thought was bizarre. But the biggest thing is, you just think back to the tape I played earlier in this conversation, Oz, about how Four Corners described right-wing nationalism in 1998 as the most dangerous ideology in politics, and whether that was being unleashed. In this episode, today in 2026, nationalism, March for Australia, One Nation, all of this very hard far-right movement is just framed as this alternative strand of conservatism that the Liberals might pick. It's like, which way will the Liberal Party go? 1990s free market economics or fascism? We'll see. Can't wait to find out. It's
funny,
just,
but it's so grim. Yeah. And the thing about this episode is the pieces were there. There is a really interesting story, right? I mentioned groups like Advance Australia. There is now in Australia the most sophisticated right-wing ecosystem that has existed, I think, in our lifetimes, and probably since any time since the 1930s. This idea where you have these really organized, quite violent, quite scary, growing, explicit white nationalist far-right movements on the ground, right? They're buttressed by groups like Advance Australia doing this stuff, quote-unquote, independently from political parties. They're both pushing parties like One Nation and the Liberals and the Nationals further to the right. All of that is being, again, echoed and supported and broadcasted by Rupert Murdoch, the Daily Mail, even the Nine Papers, even in some of these instances, The Guardian. All of this stuff is existing and feeding off each other, and it is so powerful, it is so toxic, it is obviously shifting the way politics is being done in this country. And yet, when you do an episode where you kind of look at all that stuff, you just kind of raise these ideas without laying it out for people. And I think that's why I think this conversation is so important, because it's not just about how to do journalism ethically and properly. There definitely is that. And again, if you don't want to listen to Scott and I, go listen to Tony Jones in 1998. Just look back to that. But it's also about how high the stakes are for this country, right? This society, democracy, the way that we live, how we treat people. It might have taken people a long time to realize the threat of One Nation. There's still, I think, a lot of people who don't want to accept it and are in a bit of denial, but they are real. And as evidenced by the immigration plan that Susan Lee was cooking up, what Angus Taylor's going to release, even if they don't win any seats, even if their polling drops back, they are already influencing Australian politics on immigration right now. The impact is here, is going to get bigger. Look at the United States, look at the rounding up, the deportation of migrants, look at the shooting at the hands of ICE of innocent white protesters, right? Let alone all the non-white people that ICE has killed over the past 12 and 18 months. It is going to get worse here. And the point that we're making is journalists who have a responsibility and a duty to do very basic things are not doing that. And in fact, as a result, they are helping things get worse and worse.
One reason why people aren't taking this conversation that seriously, or at least excuse not taking it seriously, is that Labor appear to be in such a commanding political position. And they go, well, who cares what's going on the right? Labor seem to have this all sewn up at the moment because the right is in such disunity, such chaos. Albanese this week has been blaming the surge of One Nation and the rightward drift of the coalition on everything from sort of phones and the algorithm to saying oh, look, this is what the right do. They implode. We've seen One Nation implode before. It's nothing to get worked up about. The answer is to just all remain calm. It seems like quite a cavalier attitude to some really dangerous forces that are being unleashed here and are on the rise. But I just thought it was interesting that Albanese and the Labor government have really kicked off this week with like a communications offensive. He is everywhere. Jim Chalmers is everywhere. They're doing lots of interviews. And it just makes me think, are they doing that because they're really so confident, or are they doing a bit of a full court press here to try and regain some momentum over the conversation?
Yeah, you know the that quote that political journalists love to use, that Sun Tzu quote, you know, never attack where your enemy is fighting itself or whatever, right? Like, sorry to butcher Sun Tzu. I feel like Labor adopted that for a long time. Like the last couple of weeks, you haven't really seen or heard much from Albanese. The government really hasn't done much on the policy front, but it's clearly gone on for so long. They're like, okay, we need to now like actually do something to remind people that we're here while these guys are fighting. So you did see this week this big media offensive from Albanese and this kind of mentioning of policy stuff in the lead up to the budget.
Totally. And I think another reason is if you look into the comments section of any post by Albanese or the Labor Party lately, it is a bloodbath in there. Like, I pulled up one and just like some of the comments to Albo, in case you missed it, this week police bashed an old lady and Muslims praying. There were 1,400 likes on that comment, Oz. Yeah. And obviously, this isn't a poll. It's not scientific, and like all politicians cop grief, but it's not exactly a hotbed of positive feedback. And I just wonder whether after the Herzog visit, after the whole of summer, where lots of different sections of the community are pretty angry with this Labor government, you've seen them this week leak out the idea they're about to announce a high-speed rail line. There's these leaks that they're considering getting rid of tax loopholes for property investors. And all of these things seem kind of targeted at the kind of people who would be really annoyed at them after summer. And yes, maybe they're in a commanding position electorally, but I think Labor's smart enough to know that like Albanese's at sort of minus 18 or minus 20% personal approval rating, like minus 20%. And they are smart enough to know that that's not sustainable. It doesn't matter if you have an electoral advantage. That is a harbinger of bad things. And I think they are pretty keen to move the conversation on from this summer and everything that has gone on and try and rebuild some loyalty with sections of the community. Now, do I think that's going to work? No. But I think they would need to actually implement some really big policies that address like economic anxiety and the material conditions of people that are drifting to One Nation. But I just think it's interesting to mention as we wrap on this, when people say, oh, well, this isn't such a big deal, what's going on the right, all this infighting, Labor still has control. If they believed that, if Labor was that confident, I don't think we would have seen from them what we've seen from them this week.
I think that's a really smart observation, and I think it suggests that even though Albanese's public line on One Nation is, as you described, it's all algorithmic stuff driving people to the extremes, they'll explode, don't worry too much about it. I don't think that is Labor's internal position. In fact, talking to Labor people, it is not their internal position. And I think there's also part of the kind of like leaking of certain policy things just going on a media offensive this week from Albanese that is like, look, even though it's fun to watch my opponents beat themselves up, the longer this country is occupied with this debate between One Nation, the Liberals and Nationals on immigration and security and safety and Muslims and terrorism, that's not good for me. Like that actually just gives Hanson way more attention. So he's trying to reclaim some of that. I also agree. I know people want us to disagree more, but I also agree with your conclusion. I think Labor is smart enough to realize there's a threat here. I think the problem for them is they're not smart enough to realize what they need to do to combat that threat. One Nation is not being the increase in One Nation's vote is not being driven by a personal love of Hanson and Joyce. And I will say this until my voice is hoarse. Like, people feel upset and angry, and they have right to be. Like, they're right to feel upset and angry. Everything's fucked. Everything's broken. Young people graduate uni with $100,000 of debt with a degree in political economics. Sorry, Gareth, friend of the pod, that makes them unemployable, right? They can't get a house. They can't get a job that is sustainable and secure. They're fucking angry. And like, if you want to stop them voting for One Nation, fix all of those problems, man. It's really not that hard. All right, coming up after the break, who on earth is editing the Sydney Morning Herald? Why is Australia obsessed with centrist US podcasters who honestly aren't even as good looking as us? And a check-in.
I don't know. A couple of them are good looking.
Scott, a few people got in touch with us about an editorial that the Sydney Morning Herald published last week after the scenes of police brutality inflicted on protesters who were opposing Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president's visit to the country. This editorial was titled, "Rather than promoting social cohesion, Min's laws have led to concerns about police brutality." And that editorial was mildly critical of the way the New South Wales government rushed through laws after the Bondi attack to grant police more powers, the kinds of powers that we saw on display and the kinds of powers that we said at the time would inevitably lead to that kind of violence at protesters. Now, Scott, you might be wondering, why people are upset about this editorial, why they're asking about it. It seems like a good thing that the Herald is now saying that these laws are bad. Well, here's why, right? The laws that the Herald is now criticizing are the very same laws, right, that the paper, back in its editorial on December 22, quote, urged all parties in the New South Wales Parliament to pass, quote, without delay, right? This is a classic example of a media outlet trying to have it both ways. At the time, they were trying to pile pressure on the government to pass these really regressive laws. And now when those laws have blown up in their face and people are kind of annoyed at the scenes that they saw, they're pretending that they think the laws are bad. But it raises the question, Scott. Editorials are written by the paper's editor, generally. And here's a quick quiz for you.
Can I just say, it's real sort of Wile E. Coyote energy. It's sort of like, I painted a tunnel for a train on this cliff. Oh no. When I run into the tunnel I've painted, it's not really there. It's incredible stuff.
Combined two of the tactics used by Wile E. Coyote in that they do a fake tunnel, right? A fake thing, so he hits a wall, and then they do the thing where you think there's more across the cliff, but then you take off the cliff and then you fall down the cliff.
Okay. Well, all right. I thought it worked. I'm at the side of the cliff.
Anyway. The point was made. But look, Scott, this kind of dueling editorials raise another question. Editorials are generally written by the paper's editor. And here's a quick quiz for you. Who is the current editor of the Sydney Morning Herald?
Well, Bevan Shields left in September, as we covered last year. And Jordan Baker was announced as the new editor. So I imagine she's writing them. No?
I mean, both of those facts are correct, but the thing is, no one really seems to know who's editing the Sydney Morning Herald.
What do you mean?
Baker was announced, you're right, 3 months ago, back in November, but she's actually not editing the newspaper yet. It's being edited by the former deputy. That's a great question. It's being edited by the guy who was the deputy under Bevan Shields, a guy called Liam Phelan. But at the same time, the executive editor of the Herald and also the executive editor of The Age, Luke McElveen, the ex-boss of the Daily Mail, is also apparently very, very, very hands-on. So there's some conjecture.
Oh, my favorite traffic reporter from the mid-2000s.
Is that what he was?
No, he just wrote one of the most horrific stories about a traffic incident to ever be published.
But yeah, so there is like this seemingly like weird committee editing the paper, and it's led to conjecture from some staff that the kind of incoherent position following Bondi, right? Where it's like, they've got to do everything they can. They've got to pass these laws to, they shouldn't have passed these laws. It's pretty bad. It's probably a reflection of like, you've got someone more right-wing like Luke McElveen who maybe is adopting the hardline positions, and perhaps the recent editorials are reflective of this kind of more traditional SMH approach, right? They want to reassure their elderly, boomer, small L liberal subscribers, we are still worried about this stuff. But then you raised the question of like, why isn't Jordan Baker the editor when she was announced 3 months ago? It's a great question. No one seems to know. She might be starting next month. She might be starting the month after. She has not been like an editor at the paper, and there's quite a bit to get your head around, you know, when you're editing and running a news organization. It's generally kind of rare, I think, for someone to go from being a reporter to editing, because you haven't done the kind of like understanding of the mechanics of how it all works. Perhaps that's what's going on. She could be being trained in that stuff. But I just thought it was interesting, given that like there are staff, let alone the public, who are very confused about who's running Sydney's, you know, most prominent newspaper right now.
Yeah. And look, I don't know if it's Luke McElveen or someone else writing those editorials. I'd also suggest, Oz, that if your experience is sort of from the Sunday Telegraph, Daily Mail, and those kind of places, you don't really care about consistency. You just go, oh, I was listening to Talkback this morning. A lot of people think we should crack down on these protesters, and you just jam out 600 words, and then you go, God, we're getting a lot of emails from people who say they don't like the police cracking the heads of these protesters. And you go, oh, yeah, the Herald stands against this brutality on our streets. And you don't really care if you contradict yourself.
You're totally right. Just, it could be in totally just contradiction. Absolutely. Yeah.
Oz, I wanted to mention that PodSave America is in Australia. They are on the ground. They are amongst us. The podcast kings, the kings of fellas talking about politics are on the ground. This is everyone's favorite cheeky chaps from the Obama White House: John Favreau, Dan Pfeiffer, John Levitt, and Tommy Vitor. They are cheeky, and they've sold out rooms.
I'm already losing it in this segment, bro. It's very funny what you're doing.
And Oz, they've sold out rooms of like over 2,000 people in Sydney and Melbourne to hear them podcast live. I know we had a great response to our live events last year, but the listeners want to know, when are we playing Hamer Hall? When are we doing 2000?
Look, this podcast has blown up in the last couple of months. So Hamer Hall, I wouldn't rule out. This podcast, dude, like I listen to this podcast more than you do, and I don't totally hate it. I do think it is hilarious, just because to kind of give people some behind the scenes on the feedback we get. We get the odd email or Instagram complaint from people that are like, I won't listen to you because you are two men, right? Or people that are like, I refuse to listen to you because you are two men. And look, I can't force people to listen to us. If you want to straitjacket your media consumption in that way, that's fine. But this is like the biggest podcast on like the left side of politics in Australia. And it's four guys, two of whom are called John. And it's genuinely very hard to listen to the show because they're like, John, what do you think about this? John, what? And they occasionally like they use their surnames, but I find it difficult to listen to for that particular reason. But it is undeniably an extraordinarily popular show, not just in the States, but here in Australia.
Yeah, and look, I find it useful to listen to sometimes when there's a really big American story going on, just to understand what that section of American politics is thinking right now.
What is the post-Obama White House line on this?
Yeah, exactly. Like, how are they processing this? It's kind of fascinating. But the reasons I wanted to talk about it this week were, one, the cultural phenomenon of shows like Pod Save America and their popularity in Australia. I think you could also put The Rest is Politics into this bracket, these overseas shows.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like to illustrate the cultural phenomenon, not only the sellout tour and those numbers, but the ABC covered this tour as a news story. They wrote like a 1,500-word article about some political commentators and their startup media company. And the Guardian podcast had, one of them on as a guest. And like that is fascinating to me in itself, in that those organizations would never have a bunch of avowedly partisan Australian podcasters on to talk about how wonderful and successful their podcast is. Yeah. Like, that's not a news story, but totally. This is. And the other part of it is more an audience perspective that I just thought would be interesting to talk about.
When I had a go at people listening to certain podcasts, but now you're about to go after audiences being dumb as well. I'm excited.
No, I'm not calling anyone dumb, Oz. But like the ABC piece actually kind of captures, I think, well, why this podcast is so popular on the other side of the world. And it sort of describes how Australians love shows like Pod Save America because it's exciting to hear the meltdowns and the descent into kind of American fascism and these liberals losing their minds, and that is a window into a more exciting politics. And one guy who they spoke to, who bought a ticket, went along, gave them this quote: "American politics is very worrying, but I think Australian politics is a bit banal." And I don't really understand
You're
how
telling me
this
that guy's
idea.
not dumb? Is that what you're going to tell me?
Well, I was just going to unpack it before I'm not going to insult anybody.
Yeah.
I just really think the only reason that people think that Australian politics is banal is because in America, when the government shuts down free speech, when they get into foreign wars for no reason, and when there are like police on the streets bashing people, there are places like, whether it's Pod Save America or whether you are more of a Hassan Piker person or a Useful Idiots person or whatever, they exist to say, hey, everyone, this is super scary and bad and awful and our rights are being eroded and this is terrifying. But when that same stuff happens here in Australia, the entire media, which does not have as many independent voices, goes, well, it's an interesting debate. I mean, should it be illegal to say from the river to the sea? Should we lock people up for that? Who can say? Should we ban immigration from Muslim countries? Well, there is an argument for it. I mean, there's some disagreement, but let's write a detailed policy analysis of that. And it sounds boring to people when the exact same things happen here, but this is what racists, nationalists, and fascists want. They want this slide to seem very boring and normal. That is what they are betting on. And what is happening in this country is very much not boring or banal. And it just drives me crazy to see sort of the same people who would criticize this show or, you know, Et Media or Lowenstein or like any of the independent media as being sort of hyperbolic or whatever, salivating over these guys, pointing out that the same policies are scary. It's
it's
bizarre.
100%. There's a couple of things there, I think. Firstly, very brutal to compare Anthony Lowenstein to Pod Save America. I don't know if you'll take kindly to that comparison.
I just compared us and just people who, you know, try and elucidate the things that are concerning.
Yeah, I think what you're stepping through, it's like this, you know, it's sort of relevant to the One Nation conversation, the denial people have in Australia about where things are at, where they've been, where they're going. This Australian exceptionalism that exists on so many topics compared to the US, where people are like, America is so crazy. Like, have you seen what their police do to black people? Have you seen what Trump is doing to migrants? Like, I always think about that phone conversation that Malcolm Turnbull and Donald Trump had back in his first term when Trump was trying to do some refugee swap with him, and he's explaining how horrifically we treat migrants. And Trump's like, wow, you guys are even worse than we are, right? And now fast forward to Trump 2, and you've got Trump's border czars literally being like, we just copied what Australia does on borders. Like, this is the Australian model. Yet when it comes to even progressive people's understanding of politics, they think America is crazy and they think Australia is normal. Like, if you're an average Australian listening to Pod Save America or The Rest is Politics, you're probably more likely to listen to The Party Room on the ABC or the morning edition at the Nine Papers than you are to listen to at Lowenstein or us. And I'm not kind of just, I don't think we're saying this because like we're jealous of their numbers or whatever. Like, the fact that places like Pod Save and The Rest is Politics exist is part of why we felt confident launching this show and doing what we do.
Absolutely.
There are models all over the world that demonstrate how much people are willing to listen to sharp, clear-eyed analysis from a genuine perspective that kind of matters and means some things and helps break things down for people. So it's more like, yes, these guys proved it. Let's try and build something that is perhaps a bit less insipid and a bit less annoying, but something that is in the same sort of overall vein as them. And it is so odd to see the same outlets in Australia who like want to pretend nothing else is going on, being like, it's so amazing that in response to rising fascism, these guys just build an independent left-wing podcast. It's incredible what's going on over there. Like, it is a really jarring kind of contradiction.
Totally it is. That's exactly it. The other quick thing I wanted to mention in keeping tabs this week, Oz, is that it is 20 years since the Chasers' War on Everything first went to air. Oz, I think for anyone in our generation, it was a pretty seminal cultural kind of touchstone, that show, and obviously known for some pretty like risky stunts. It is obviously, it is often kind of retold the most famous story being how they conned their way into the Apex security zone while George W. Bush was in Sydney, only for Chaz to emerge dressed as Osama bin Laden in the middle of like a sniper-laden, cordoned-off street.
Yeah.
Obviously an all-timer.
Imagine if we tried to do that as Herzog or something like that. They will literally just shoot us now, wouldn't they?
Well, exactly. That's what I was about to say.
Oh,
is
sorry,
like,
sorry. Do you want me to
No.
not say that? I won't say that. Nick.
Oh, okay.
Do your bit. Yeah.
I mean, personally, I prefer to highlight some of the maybe slightly less celebrated moments, like when they got into the studio of A Current Affair after rinsing it for months and months on air. They had a friendly insider at Channel 9 let them in through the fire escape and just literally started filming on the actual set of A Current Affair. Or I loved when Chris Taylor basically just like rinsed Make-A-Wish children who were about to die, and that made it to air somehow on the ABC.
That led to another political scandal. If I remember, John Howard was upset about that. Yeah.
He was upset about it. But I wanted to mention it just to underline, for people who sort of go like, oh, well, what's the evidence that the ABC's, gone further to the right or has become more risk averse or more responsive to criticism? It's like, can you imagine if an ABC production pulled a stunt where they like got through the security cordon for Isaac Herzog and jumped out in a costume like that? Like,
Yeah.
they'd be hung, drawn, and quartered. Like before the end of the business day, Hugh Marks would deliver Chaz Lucidello's head in a jar to Chris Kenny at Sky News and beg for clemency. So it's just like the ABC is so far from ever putting anything like that show on air ever again, Oz. And it makes me sad.
Let's not leave out, dressing up in blackface to do the Jackson 5. There's a lot of stuff.
That was my show, Oz. That wasn't them. That was my show, Hungry Beast.
That was Chaser.
I think it was Hungry Beast.
It was 100% Chaser because I interviewed Chaz about it on the ABC. So.
I'm gonna fact check that, and we're gonna leave this in or cut it, depending on.
All right, then if you're not sure about it, let's not talk about it. The other thing that I think is just kind of really obvious in terms of the legacy of that era and how frozen things are. We mentioned this a few times before on the show. How much of the current ABC lineup is like legacy of the Chaser, not just the main guys who still have like shows. Many of them do on TV and radio, but how many other like even the next generation of ABC talent came through those productions. And if you don't make shows like that, you will end up in total stagnation, which honestly is kind of where we are at, sadly, with ABC television at the moment anyway. It's got in another example, just kind of wrap up today's episode of how far TV networks have fallen. I want to touch briefly on the latest with CBS in the United States. This is the network that was taken over by Trump's billionaire pro-Israel friend David Ellison, who then very promptly installed the right-wing pro-Israel Bari Weiss as the news boss. Two examples from this week, literally just this week, that show how US news networks that once bravely used to hold presidents and people like Senator McCarthy to account have completely capitulated to the regime. The first is the axing of Anderson Cooper at 60 Minutes. Cooper is well known for being a CNN anchor, but he also was a 60 Minutes reporter for 2 decades. When he left, he said it was to spend more time with his family, but reporting by outlets in the US, including Puck News and Status, have revealed that it was actually due to tensions with Bari Weiss. And look, I don't really have strong feelings about Cooper as a journalist, but if Bari Weiss hated him, then I am like the biggest Cooper stan alive right now. And this kind of tension comes after a very high-profile example that we covered of Weiss holding a 60 Minutes episode into migrant detention because she was worried that it would offend the Trump government. Do you have any thoughts, Scott, on Anderson Cooper, 60 Minutes?
Not massively. I mean, although it is just when, Cooper is a very straight down the line anchor who obviously has been on CNN for, 2 decades now. The idea that he is too far to the left, I suppose, compared to Weiss is a scary thing for, again, as we've said again and again, one of the great television newsrooms in the entire world and has such a huge history. What I've been excited about, though, about Bari Weiss's changes is this other report from Semaphore that she's introducing a Jack Daniels sponsored segment on the Friday evening news.
The Whiskey Fridays.
Whiskey Fridays. I mean, can we get? I mean, I know we've had a few pops at Carl Stefanovic, but if Carl could do the Friday night Channel 9 news with a whiskey in his hand, I think I'd tune in for Whiskey Fridays in Australia. Just sell out to Jack Daniels, have a drunk middle-aged man talk about the news. Maybe that'll save television bulletin news.
I mean, I don't know if now's the right time to disclose this, but we could just call these episodes Whiskey Thursdays because I'm loaded every morning when we record the show. Look, the second example from CBS, again, just in the last couple of days I wanted to mention is from Stephen Colbert. He said that he was prevented by CBS. He said he was prevented by CBS network executives from airing an interview with a Democrat politician who's currently in a tight contest to win a Texas Senate race, because the Federal Communications Commission, which is the regulator, was going to determine that that would be a biased interview and potentially fine the station. Now, in the end, the interview was published on YouTube, which is outside the regulator's control, but this is a pretty extraordinary example of both government and network intervention. Stephen Colbert has interviewed so many people from so many different sides of politics over the decades now, but such a clear example of how Trump, using both explicitly the power of the government regulator and through his relationships with the billionaire owners of media companies, is just completely dominating the media landscape in America. It's deeply, deeply worrying stuff. Not to get to Pod Save America.
Yeah, it is deeply worrying. I mean, I think one positive is that culturally, I think particularly post the ICE raids in Minnesota, culturally, Trump appears to be really a bit under siege, and a lot of that kind of soft Trump voting support is becoming very critical of him. But I think the thing that progressives always struggle with is to even fathom the damage he's going to be able to do in these years, like these mergers, these takeovers. These are like the organs of information are being handed to very, very right-wing billionaires, and no Democratic president can undo that. The damage is done. And
Yeah,
not
exactly.
just Americans, but Australians. It's a global media ecosystem. We'll be living with that for a long time.
Yeah, and remember, Channel 10, our favorite news network, is owned
Absolutely.
by CBS. It's all happening. All right, that is it from us for today's episode. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left us a review or shared it with a friend. And you can email us questions or tips at contact@lamestream.com.au. Thank you to our producer, Bez. Thank you to our video producer, Schwen. Thank you to Scott. See you on Monday.
Oh, thanks for thanking me. See you Monday, Oz.